Hello, my name is Charlotte and this is my presentation. And my presentation is about the civil rights movement in USA. And first of all, I will start to tell you what is in my presentation. The first thing is what is the civil rights movement? The second thing is who was leading the way for the civil rights movement and how did racial discrimination occur in USA? And are there still racism in USA? If yes, how could that be? First of all, I will start to tell you about what the civil rights movement is. The civil rights movement was a group of a lot of black people that were fighting for their rights. Because back then there was a lot of segregation that was splitting the black people from the white people. For example, there was these laws called Jim Crow laws. The laws could, for example, be that black people couldn't drink from the same water fountain as the white people could, or that the black people couldn't shake hands with a white police officer. That was some of the reasons why the black people had begun the civil rights movement, so they could have the same rights as the white people. Rights like good jobs, that they could go to school without being segregated from the white people, and just so they could be treated like normal people. The civil rights movement was also made because the black people wanted to show the white people that they were willing to fight for their rights, and they were willing to pay with their own life, because the white people wasn't so glad that the black people suddenly were standing up for themselves, and some of the white people were also trying to stop them. But the civil rights movement was so big and there were so many people supporting them that it was also almost impossible to stop them. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people will gather to the historical March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was a massive demonstration against the political and social injustice that were in America back then. This was a big step for the civil rights movement. There was also white people who had showed up to support the black people. This march is also well known for Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream." In 1960, there was made a non-violent coordination committee, also known as N or SNCC. This was made so there could be a discussion about segregation, and it had to stop. Okay, now I'll tell you about who was leading the way for the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was built up through the years by anti-segregation demonstrators. And through the years, more and more black people were becoming a part of the movement to fight together against the political and social injustice. Some of the people that we know well who was a part of the civil rights movement was Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, and a lot of more people. Also well-known artists like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Josephine Baker was singing at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom demonstration. Now I'll tell you about how the racial discrimination occur in USA. Back in 1619, the first black people, the first black American slaves was being brought to America. Back then it was important to the white Americans to grow tobacco and sell it to England. But the American people thought that if they had slaves to do the work, it would go faster and they didn't have to pay the black slaves. Back then, the white people was treating the black people like animals. They weren't getting enough food and they didn't have their own home with clean water. They didn't have anything. Back then, the American white people didn't saw black people as there was their people. They saw them as workers without rights, and in 1641 slavery was legal in America. The black slaves were also being used to picking cotton because the American people had found out that England was glad for that types of textile. The black slaves were called black gold back then, and the black people was white people's property back in the 60s. But between 1774 and 1804, all the South states in USA had abolished slavery, but the North states, as for example Mississippi, was still using slavery. December 6, 1835, the Third Amendment was found. This was made for the black people to not be slaves anymore and to get freedom and have the same rights as white people. And it was also made so the black people also could serve the Union Army. On July 9, 1868, the Fourth Amendment was found. This was made for the black people to have the same right and protection as the citizens in America. And last, on February 3, 1870, the 15th Amendment was found. This is the last amendment in the Civil War Amendment. This amendment was made so the American African people could vote. And the amendments say that it outlaws discrimination based on race, color, and previous condition of servitude. After all the slavery, it was hard for the white people in America to see black people as humans again, because for so many years they had seen black people as animals and their property. So the slavery wasn't just over to the black people. And in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan was also known as the KKK was found in the South States of America. This was a clan of white Americans who didn't like the fact that the black people wasn't slaves anymore. The KKK was torturing many black Americans. They were killing black Americans, torturing them, raping them, burning their towns down, and worst of all, they were lynching them. And that means that they were hanging them maybe in the middle of a city, and then the people could look at them being lynched. And often the times at the lynching would stand in newspapers so the white people could come and look. Now I will tell you about if there's still racism in America, and if yes, why. The KKK does still exist in America today, and there are still a lot of members. That are against black people in America. But after the KKK lost back in 1960, to the civil rights movement, there are no longer people who are lynching black people in front of a whole city or are killing the black people as they did back then. And the KKK was also getting a lot smaller. but there are still Americans. That means that the racism is a big problem in USA today. And that was all for my presentation. Thank you for listening.